Hi everyone. I think looking at it, we've probably got everybody joining that is going to join now, so we'll make a start. Hopefully you're able to see my screen, and welcome to the Key System Security and Maintenance Workshop for Sage 200 Professional. Just a little bit of housekeeping. If you can't hear us, you do need speakers and headphones. We are recording the session and we will be able to send the link out afterwards. And you should see a little window, a little option on the Teams window for Q&A. If you've got any questions, pop them in there. My colleague Rachel is on the call as well. So if there is anything I miss and it's to do with the call, Rachel will be able to jump in. Otherwise, we'll pick up any product related questions at the end. So a little bit of an agenda about what we're going to cover today, just make sure everybody is seeing what they're expecting to. We're going to start by looking at systems and security, look at how we manage user access and how we can check who's got access to what within the system, as well as looking at different audit trails that are available to see who's made changes perhaps to certain data or posted transactions in the Sage 200 system. We're going to then talk about backup in terms of the strategy that you should have for backup and the key files that you should be backing up as a minimum for the backup for Sage 200. Look at our data management processes and how we can archive data to improve system performance, and also how we can perform verifications and validations of that data as well. So our first kind of subject we want to cover there is the security within the system. So what we're going to look at, and this isn't going to be death by PowerPoint by any means, I'm going to mainly be hands-on within the product. What we're going to look at is what we need to think about with the security within Sage 200. Firstly, who can log in, what they can access, and do they actually need more access or less access than they've got, and how you check that. Due to the situation we've been in recently, I think it's been very clear to people that there are certain things that maybe needed to be changed, and you needed to review things quite quickly. And hopefully a lot of those changes have been made. But now that you've got people coming back to work and back into the office, you may want to just pick up those points and have a look at them again. So we'll cover those first. So these are done through roles. So we're going to look at assigning and changing roles, and then some settings that are outside of the system administration of Sage 200 that are actually within Sage 200 itself that are also important to consider. We're going to look at how we can tell who's logged on, when they've logged on, and also what they've accessed, because equally this will help us make those decisions around those roles that we're assigning to the users and what access people are given and where. So let's jump into Sage 200. I'm using the latest version, the 2020 spring release of Sage 200. So there may be some features that you're not familiar with. If you notice anything you want to ask a question on, we've got time, pop it into the Q&A, and I'll come back to it at the end. Otherwise, I'll answer any questions offline as well that you might need me to. So the first thing when we're thinking about user access within Sage 200 is there are a couple of access points that you need to be aware of from a network point of view, not just from a Sage point of view. For users to have access to Sage 200, they have to sit in what's called a group policy group within the network, and this will mean more to those of you that are kind of IT orientated in your roles. We have a user permission group on the network in what's called Active Directory for Sage 200 users, and the users that need to log into Sage have to sit in that. When you log into system administration, which can be done from a server, or you can have this installed on the relevant client machines, it will check that group within your network setup to see if there are any new users or users that have been disabled. And that's what's called Active Directory authentication, or AD integration, whatever you want to call it. That means that basically when you double click on the Sage 200 icon or double click on the system administration icon. Depending on your access and depending on your network user, you will either be permitted access and get on and do your job, or it will tell you don't have access to Sage 200 and it completely blocks you from getting in. So that's the kind of the first level of security. You need to make sure the users are in the right groups, and that's something that we can advise on or your IT partner can advise on. The next thing, when you log into system administration, it shows you how many existing accounts you have. This isn't relevant to your number of users. Your number of users that you pay on your license is in the license section. So that shows me I've got 6. And because I'm using concurrent licensing, I can have as many Sage 200 users set up as I want. I can only get 6 in the system at once. So that's where that number comes from. And existing accounts means accounts that still sit in that group policy group. They may not be active, they may not be people that log in, but they still have network permissions, therefore still sit in the system. And it shows me also here how many accounts are logged in. I could click this hyperlink and it would show me, which we'll come back to that in a second. So in terms of our actual users, when we're looking at people who've got access to Sage 200, we need to just be aware of a few things. So availability is, can they or can they not log into Sage or the web portal or whatever it is. If they're disabled, then they cannot log into the system. They still existed as user and you could turn them back on. So if you've maybe got some seasonal staff who you give reporting access to, in a summer season, maybe you have more people working for you, those users can still exist. Their same accounts and login details can stay in the system and you just turn that user back on later. Similarly, with the web user, a web user is what it used to be called. It's now called a connected user. These are those users that have access to the Sage 200 self-service portal. That's the browser page for things like workspaces, accessing the Excel reports. You can submit expenses and timesheets through there if you've got project accounting, and more recently you can raise purchase requisitions through there if you've got purchase order processing within the commercials side of the Sage 200 product stack. That web page can be published externally. Again, it will depend on your IT setup whether that's possible, and what security you've got in place and what your company's policies are around data sharing. But that web portal is another type of user setup, and it is possible for somebody to be a desktop user and have web access because you need to get into the information out on the road. The next section of access is, do I have access to this? Do I have, as a user, access to system administration? And there's a bit of logic to apply here. If somebody has restricted access to Sage 200, would you give them access to system admin? Now, you either trust them implicitly and know they won't change their own access, therefore you maybe would, but realistically, if somebody's got restricted access, they probably shouldn't have admin access. So we can see that based on the roles, which we'll come to in a second. Users don't, admins do, generally. We've then got a few other features that we'll look at in a second in terms of a user's setup and how we administer it. But I'm going to be using the administration user today because then I've got access to everything and we can look at everything we need to. Plus, that's how my Windows user's logged on. It's logged on as me, therefore it's logging in with those details. So I can see the users enabled, when they last logged into the system, when the menu, whether they can edit the menu so they can build their own custom menus on the left-hand side in Sage, and whether they get things like email notifications rather than having to go into an authorized list. Do they have access to to the web portal? Default information about this user, so the information around their login. So email notifications would go to this email address. It will also be able to pick these fields up on templates and printouts and document designs and things like that. And also, what companies do they have access to? So you may have a multiple companies created in your Sage 200. You can have as many as you want. There isn't a limit. A user can have access to all companies, so you don't have to remember to give them access as you create new companies in Sage, or you pick company by company which companies they can access and which they can't. So these are the companies that are available to log in, these are the ones that they can log into, or in this case, I'm an admin, we're logging into all of them. And we saw here the member of, these are the roles and functions this user has access to, and we choose which is their primary role. So if the financial management user is the primary role and there is a piece of functionality turned off on there, it would cascade down and vice versa. Okay, but we'll come back into roles in a second. So when we looked at that initial slide, I said, not only do we need to know who can log in and when they're logging in, we also need to know what they've got access to. Well, we do this through the features option. What the features option does, it replicates the menu in Sage 200, including any customizations, and it will show us when we select the specific menu option, which users have got access to it. So I'm not having to go through each user or each role to check it. So something that's probably quite important to control access to, as well as system admin or a period control settings, is things like bank details. We've probably got a policy in place where I would guess our finance department are the only people that can edit and access that, and maybe even view it. In more recent versions of Sage 200, it is now possible to completely remove the banking tab from a user in Sage. So I want to have a look and see who's got access to that banking tab, as well as kind of controlling, taking that access off if I need to. So to do that, under Purchase Ledger, under Advanced, we've got a new option, Bank Details. Now this will either appear at the very top of the list or it'll be the last option in the list, depending on how you've got to this version. So if you've got to this version via an upgrade, it will be the last option likely. If this is a brand new data set, then it'll probably be towards the top. And it's just how the columns are ordered, but it will be in this advanced list. So when I'm looking at bank details, it's telling me there that I've already got the control in place that people who sit within the finance management role have access to bank details. So my user that's logged in, if I go into Sage, into Purchase Ledger and find one of my suppliers, it's going to allow me into that tab. So if I come into good old AB Cookers, and I amend their details. Sorry, I've come into the wrong window, bear with me. Amend account rather than double click. I've got the bank tab there, as we can see. So I'm just going to put some details in here, just so we can see what this does once we've stored them. Okay. So I've saved AB Cookers. I'm now going to come out of Sage and we're going to change this user's access in a second. So the reason I had access to that is because I am a finance manager. So within my roles within the finance manager, these roles are customizable to your system. Everybody will have probably a default of admin and users, but if we want to be a little bit more controlled, and we should be more controlled in the data that people have access to, I can turn on and off features. So I could create a purchase ledger procurement role that's maybe got access to lots of purchase order processing, but none of the financial sides of purchase ledger. A little bit of stock control, maybe some of sales order processing. So we can be quite controlled in what users can have access to. If I have a look at my administrator role, it tells me, again, overrides those accesses. It tells me whether it's a remote only user, so it's somebody who's got to log in through the portals. They can't just log in the system, and it tells me who are members of this role, and I could add them to it. And I can change the features they have access to here, or within the features section, if I right click on the specific feature in the menu, I can choose to change the role authorization here as well. So I can see only finance management has access to that aspect. Let's come back into roles, into our administrator and into features to see what we've got access to. So I can see within the purchase ledger, my finance manager doesn't have access to bank details. When he's not having access to bank details, he probably also doesn't need to do any of these other things. So let's take off a few more. They've equally not got access to the cash book or the nominal from a transactional perspective, but they do have access to accounting system manager, because maybe I need them to be able to do things like data purges or be able to roll periods on when other people aren't available to do it. So my user has access to that tick box because they've got the finance manager user access as well. Well, actually, I've given them the access they need. I don't need them to be part of the finance manager group. I only want them to have the access I've given them under administrator. I could create a role specific to a user if I wanted to really tailor things down to individuals. But I'm going to keep mine quite simple. Administrator needs administrator access. Finance users need finance user access. Salespeople need salespeople access. If I log back into Sage, we'll continue to look at system admin. I can check my active users within accounting system administration. So if I log into HBP here, either from the hyperlink at the top, it tells me how many people are logged in, or within that list, it will show me who is logged into Sage. So I can see that Steph has now logged into Sage 200, and I can just see the one thing that they're logged in, basically. So I'd be able to ring round if I needed to take a backup or reboot a server and ask them to log out. I can refresh this list and it will tell me once they've logged out of the system. If I now come back into Sage and look again at my purchase ledger and at my supplier list, I can still see the supplier accounts. If I now amend AB Cookers, I've no longer got that bank tab. So users that don't need access to the bank tab don't have access to the bank tab. But when that feature came in, what Sage also added was a new audit facility. So as well as being able to remove access to that tab, Sage also tracks who makes changes to it. So we've always had a transaction audit list, which we'll come back to in a second, but we've now got a new audit log. If I come in to view it, this is used for two things. It's used for the purchase requisition approvals. So where has this been? Who created it? What's happened with it? And then they've applied the same logic and technology to the supplier bank details option, which will show me who's changed what and when. So we can see that change that I made there. It's stored and tracked. It will track creation of bank details, amending and deletion. And as out of the box as standard, Sage is silently tracking those within the system and somebody can come in and visibly view them. I'll explain to you in a second, once we've looked at transaction audit, how that actually can be very powerfully enhanced now through Office 365. The transaction audit serves two purposes. It's a full audit trail of everything that's happening in the system, but also allows me to run and filter this information to see what's happened and when. So it pulls together all of those screens that I need to be able to look at things. So amending customers and suppliers, customer and supplier account inquiries, but also the full nominal postings, journals, everything else that's happened in the system. The same as I can with other list views, I can create new filters and sort out this data. I can also add extra columns in to be the relevant information that I want to see, and I can export this either as a full list or just selected records out to Excel, or if I'm linked to it, Office 365. So I'm just going to filter down for nominal bank payments, really quick and easy to do. Once we've got them set up, I can also search for specific values. So I know there was a transaction for £100 posted, but I don't know when it was or who did it. I just know it's been done in the last couple of days. I can search for £100, sort the transaction order. So it's been done today for £100 and it appears to be on Chrome's account. Well, I know that's a supplier because it's a purchase payment. So let's do a supplier transaction inquiry. So let's get Chrome Decor, and there's my £100 transaction. So the URN numbers, as we know, are our links. The user number is the number from system administration, the user number that's associated there. If you see a 0 in this column, it's probably been imported from a third-party system if they've not got a user number assigned to their user. But yeah, we can get down and filter right down to that information. And as I say, it can be exported to Excel. So if from QS purposes or to conform with an ISO, I need to export extracts of that, I can put it into Excel and give it to non-Sage users in that way. Sage 200 from, I think it was the winter release in 2018, it first came in. Sage introduced integration to the Microsoft Power Apps and Power Automation platforms. So what this essentially does is gives me more functionality than just Excel that came in 2015, in email integration that came kind of a little bit before that. I can now link to OneDrive. I can now link to Skype. I can now link to Flow and Power Apps and Power Automation. So why is this important to what we're talking about? Well, what I can do with this and what can the real power of this feature is I can do two things. When bank details are changed, there is a standard out-of-the-box flow automation that you can install with Sage 200 that will do the audit tracking as normal, but then email a specific person and alert them to the fact that that has happened. You can have an automation that says, Steph's created a new supplier account on the purchase ledger. Do you want her to allow her to use that? So it will create the supplier account. It will remove the credit status, essentially making the account unusable, making it on hold. It will notify whoever I've said it needs to notify, be that a group of people or a user. I can then say yes or no, whether I'm happy for that to be a supplier account. When I say yes, the account's available, puts the credit status back in, it allows me to raise those transactions. When I say no, it will notify the user, in my case me, and say, no, you're not creating that supplier. And by the way, I've deleted it from the system, and it will remove the new supplier entirely and prevent that being used. This automation within the database is all thanks to this integration. And part of this is also the introduction of things like PEG. So people may have seen PEG used elsewhere in Sage products. It's essentially a chat bot that sits alongside Sage 200, and you use it within a messaging tool such as Facebook Messenger or Skype, and you can essentially ask questions of the system. So PEG, what's my latest debtors balance? PEG, how many sales orders have I got outstanding, not yet delivered? Now, it seems quite comical, but when we think about how we're using this sort of technology in our day-to-day lives, actually we probably would use something like this if we needed a quick bit of information when our offices are closed and 20% of our staff are working, but they're all tied up on dealing with people, and unfortunately the other 80% are having to be on furlough. I need to get quick answers. Things like the Power Automation and the PEG application within Sage 200's Office 365 integration really allows me to do a lot more with that data that's always just been sat on my server and I've had to log in and access it. I can now get at this information out on the road through OneDrive, through 365, through Power Apps, through our existing self-serve portals. So it's kind of worth pointing that out, because it will be something that a lot of people won't be taking advantage of. You do need to have a connector, and there are certain setups that have to happen on your Office 365, but at its simplest, you just need a business premium subscription, now called Microsoft 365 Standard. And most people who are using 365, that is the level of product they will be using. So a little bit about the automation there. So we've seen there how we can use those roles and feature lists to check who's got access to what and make those changes. They're not huge things that we would be doing all the time. They are things that are done periodically or when we need new users, but it's quite important to think about what that database contains when we move on to what we're going to talk about now. So, second part of our presentation we said we would talk about today is system maintenance. So what we're going to look at now is when and why should I back up, which seems like a silly statement, but we'll come on to the whys and wherefores in a second. I'm going to look at archiving, what I can archive, what I can remove, and should I remove any data from the system, and how that fits in with housekeeping, and then again how housekeeping then leads on to verifying data when we need to. So we need to we've looked at controlling and assigning user access, but we need to then look at how we control and maintain that data really that's in the underlying system. So I'm going to start with backup, and this is a little bit PowerPointy, and I apologise for this, but there isn't really another way I can explain it. There isn't a manual backup process within Sage 200 due to the complex nature of the product. It needs to be part of your backup strategy. So when and why do we need to back up? And these are just a few of the headline reasons why. The biggest and most important one, I personally feel, is this one. You've put data in the system. You don't want to put the data in the system again, should something go wrong. Or, not that something's gone wrong, something changed, and actually I need to go back and redo a load of stuff. I don't want to redo all of my user access and all of my document designs just because I need to rekey an invoice. So with that in mind, you need to have a strategy, and you need to stick to the strategy. Rule of thumb, just back it up. But when I say you need a strategy, you need to think about, what do I need access to as a business? And this is a bigger picture discussion generally of when I'm thinking about disaster recovery, and we all don't want to think about that. But I think the situation we've been in recently has made people think about this a lot more, because traditionally server-based systems were backed up by somebody inserting a cartridge into a file server. It works great, but you've got to have somebody in your office inserting said cartridge into said server, and somebody has to check it happened. You also need to check you can restore it. But, and this is a bigger topic, as I said, than Sage, but are you able to get your system back up and running as quickly and as effectively as you need to using that method of backup? I would question just having a inserted cartridge backup will work for every single business. You need to think about, what do I need to do first? So what is the most important thing to my business? Is it communicating via email and then invoicing a customer? Well, there's a lot of ways you can mitigate the risk with email, so let's focus on the backup of our data. I need to be able to get my salespeople chasing down leads, and then I need to deal with my stock control. So you need a strategy that means you can restore your CRM system before the Sage side, or I need to deal with the stock control before I let people back in CRM. I need to restore 200 before I worry about CRM. There's a lot of things to think about. But what is most key is making sure you're backing up everything you should be. And we do see this quite often, particularly when it comes to upgrades or server changes. This does get missed, and people do forget which aspects need to be backed up, or they change their backup method and don't fully roll it out across the whole of Sage 200. This is certainly something also, if you're with your IT partner, we can help with. Obviously, account managers within the Sage team can have these conversations with customers we don't have the IT relationship with, and they can advise you what you need to let your IT team know. So the first thing is the SQL database. So the SQL database is the database where all the information is, all your invoices, your audit logs, your stock records, all your customers, who owes you money, who you owe money to, what your balance sheet looks like. All of that is in a database. It's in one little container, as they're called. And you can find out where that is if you're an admin user by going into system administration, as we saw earlier, and going into the companies option. And in there, it gives us the server name and the database name. So my HBP company that we've been logging into is on Sage 200 demo, and it's Sage 2020 R1, and it's company number 1 in my dataset. So how does that look in SQL? Well, not many people, unless they're an IT person, will see this normally, but essentially I have a list of databases, and there it is. There's my Sage 2020 R1. And if you notice, we've also got the other databases as well. There are others. There's a couple probably relating to customizations to a till system or similar. And then there's one really critical one that I mentioned earlier that I said we'll come back to. This system administration sits in its own database. So quite often where there's been issues with backups, we found that people are very rightly backing up this aspect, but not this aspect. By not backing up system configuration, you don't lose any of your history or any of your transactions or who owes you money. But what you do lose is all the time you've spent on roles and users and setting up those features. The links to things like Office 365 get broken. You lose the connection and installation links to customizations that you've maybe had done and developed. So yes, you can recreate that manually, but you've got to remember what all those features were that you turned on and off on different users. So it's very important to make sure that at the minimum, you are backing up the configuration and the database. Ideally, you're backing up the entire server that the whole thing sits on. But as well as that, we need to back up the physical files. So all your custom reports, all your tweaks you've done to Excel reports and uploaded back into the system, your statement designs, your spooler where you've dumped all of your reporting out to like yesterday because it's month end and you're going to print them off today. All of that is sat within this installation physical files. So there'll be a Sage folder of some description on the file server that Sage runs from, and within there there'll be things like customizations, there'll be our Excel reporting, our installers. So this is the application settings that save you again having to have all your report designs redone. And I'm saying this is the minimum, so as you can appreciate, and I'm sure you do, and it's probably preaching to the choir, I'm an ex-support person, so I'm very passionate about people taking backups, which sounds a little odd to some people, but I think it's really important. And it's very important to talk about it now before we move on to the next step, because everything we're going to talk about from now, if something happens that means we need to roll back, we need to know we've got all of this stuff to roll back to. And based on our strategy, our backup strategy, we know how quickly we can get back up and running with it. So you need to know what the expectations of that backup are. Is it going to take somebody an hour to get you back up and running, or 3 days, 4 days? And that sounds crazy, but that can be the reality depending on the backup strategy you've got. So it's very important to think about this, even though we're talking about Sage 200. So we're going to jump back into product now. I've ranted on about backups enough. data management. There's a number of things we can do to make sure Sage is able to perform at its optimum. There are a number of things we should be doing regularly, and there are tools we can use to check data as well. So the first of those is the archive. So hopefully we've all seen this. When we come into a customer account and we look at do an account inquiry, and we look at the customer's accounts or the supplier accounts or sales order processing, we always have current and historical. Similarly, if I go to the nominal ledger and have a look at any of my nominal accounts, I will have the same. I've taken nominal accounts off my user, haven't I? I don't have nominal accounts. Let's look at it in a workspace. Our nominal accounts would have the same thing. We have current and history in very much the same way. When we're looking at transactions, we would have that breakdown against the accounts. So how does that end up there? How do those transactions end up in history? Well, there's a couple of things we have to do it. We have a default setting within each ledger setup. So within sales, purchase, nominal, stock, sales order processing, they're all separate. Purchase order processing, they're all an individual's default setting. So when we create a new customer record, it will be set to keep transactions for defaultly however many months we set here, because that's our policy. But we can override that on an account by account basis or a stock record by stock record basis. That control then has to have a process that's run to move those transactions to archive. So there's a separate process in each one. It sits within the period end routines, and it's the account maintenance function. Now, this is something certainly at a minimum we would expect this is done once a year. Some customers will do this more frequently, so they will do it quarterly or even monthly, dependent on the volumes of data. And what it actually does is, by moving it from that current tab to that historical tab, it will speed the performance of the system, because it will make the system defaultly only present you with whatever is flagged to be current. You can then choose to include that historical data, providing it's still in the system, in those reports. So you can always do retrospective reporting on things that have gone into history, but by default, when you run a report or you make an inquiry or you go into a workspace, it's always going to work on the current tab, not on the history, unless you tell it to. With the sales ledger, we have a number of different options, and the reason for that is it depends on these account statuses. So we have three different account statuses. We have our open item accounts. So when I go into an inquiry screen, I can see every transaction, be it paid or otherwise. There are open item accounts. Balance forward accounts are accounts where I only want to see a total per month. So maybe it's a trade counter account where there will be money outstanding. The details in sales order processing, I don't need it in my ledger. There's too many transactions. But all of the postings will still happen to the nominal as normal. And then we have auto allocation accounts. So these are those accounts where it always matches up. So there'll be an invoice for £1,000, a receipt of £1,000, an invoice for £2,000, a receipt for £2,000. There's no need for somebody to manually allocate them. They're probably being imported from another system anyway. So the invoice might come in one month, the money will come in another month, and it's perfectly fine for the system to go through and satisfy that account off. So it'll start with the oldest debt and allocate down from there. So that's where we have these different settings for our archive accordingly. So by choosing the first one, that will take any transactions which are completed, so effectively fully paid, check their date, check what my archive status is, and move them to history accordingly. Our balance forward accounts, it will do two things. It will clear down those transactions which are already paid, completed within a period. and it will also create me my running monthly totals. So instead of me having 10 invoices for May, if I ran this process, I would have one line for a value outstanding for May with a total of the transactions for May. I'm not going to get those individuals. And then the final routine, when we run it, goes through and does that automatic allocation process across all of my accounts. So as you can see, this does mean that I should have a backup before doing this. This is a process that if the power went off, we would need to go back to backup. So it's very much like our month-end routines. I wouldn't do my month-end and clear everything down and run these processes without a backup, ever. Same as doing a payment run and things like that. There's certain processes we need to make sure we've got backups before we do them. Equally, if we had a situation where we'd lost power for whatever reason, I would also need to do a data verification. So there's two times we would do this. One would be after an event such as a power cut, because we don't know what records people were in. And what this does is there's also one available for units of measure to check our stock as well. But we're going to look at the financial one because everybody will have this. It will go through and it will effectively check, does what I think is outstanding on that account match to the transactions? Does the invoice total match to the totals of those transactions? Is the credit limit exceeded? Blah, blah, blah. So it's going to go through and check basically that the data in the list matches the total on this front screen here. Now it says you must have all users logged out. You must, because you don't want people posting transactions in whilst you're doing this. It's not going to know where it gets to, and it's probably not going to allow you to either. And equally, we need to have a backup because, as you can see there is an option to correct for any issues. So we can do this for one account or all of our accounts. And depending on the amount of data we've got, this can take a while to run. So we can run this on sales, purchase, nominal, cash book, as I say. We can also run it on the commercial modules. As I said, I would be running this on after an issue, but I would also run this as part of my month-end process. This is checking, part of the reconciliation, that if there's a difference between my debtors and my balance sheet, is it because of this? Is there an issue in my accounts because somebody unplugged a PC while somebody was in the middle of putting on an invoice? It would tell you how many errors, and it would tell you how many are fixable, and generally they'll be fixed here. There'll be a list of reasons why, what the problem is. You can print that out, go and look into them, come back, take that back up and run it again. But as I said, this is something we would say you need to be doing this on a frequency basis, and certainly this is something we can help with as part of our proactive support, but it's something to be aware of because a lot of people don't run this process after there has been an issue. I know people don't run it as a matter of course quite often. It's something that I do mention to a lot of customers. One other piece of kind of data integrity checking is a bit of legislation that came in a while ago. You might have heard of it, GDPR. Feels like millions of years ago, but it's only actually been 2 years. We need to be able to now check for personally identifiable information in a system. Now, there are caveats to this, obviously, and everybody has different rules that they need to follow for their organisation. But there are contractual obligations for you keeping data. There are HMRC requirements for keeping data. There are reasons to anonymise things. There are reasons to not anonymise things. And I'm not going to go into all of that. What this essentially allows you to do is find out where that data is in the key fields within the accounting system. It's not going to check everywhere, but it will check references and contact names and account names and so on. If I search for the name Taylor, it's going to find that everywhere. Well, I'm not going to be changing a supplier's name, their limited company name. That's not personally identifiable information. But Jane Taylor may no longer work at Kitch, and actually the resolution to this is me just deleting her contact record. I can go and do that. What I can't do is edit a completed sales order. What I can do, if it fits with my data retention and if it fits with my need to trace and my need to understand my data, I could go and archive and then purge that information. So I can archive, as we've just seen, and then we could run a purge process to actually clear that data down. Now, I say if this fits with our data retention policies and everything else, there are a number of things to think about before you start purging data. You can purge data from Sage 200, absolutely, it is possible. However, if you need to report on it, if you want to know what you sold somebody 2 years ago, if you want the traceable history of a stock item from a quality perspective, you need to really think about whether you do it. The option is there, and you do need to take a backup before you do it. And the caveat is it has to have already been archived. So you've already followed one data procedure before you move on. So we've looked there at how we can archive our data to improve the speed of the system, check the integrity of our ledgers, and also if we have to purge data for compliance reasons. Okay. So as I said, we've looked at our roles and our features, very important, and we've got some help sheets and things that we can share and links to online help if you're a bit unsure on what options you need to untick and tick there. We've looked at our audit trails and we've talked about that new fantastic feature in Office 365 that's now available. Discussed our backup strategies and data management, and also how we can archive and verify our data. So hopefully that's kind of helped and given you the information you need. And we do plan to run more of these sessions. So if you've got any suggestions on what you would like to see, please do let us know. We want to kind of empower you to be the administrators of your system as much as we possibly can, but we are here to help and advise where necessary. So I guess, are there any questions? Okay, there's one question I can see there in the chat. I'm going to just jump straight on actually, because I should have said it as we went through. The GDPR check will not check things like memos and analysis fields. So if you need to think about where you're holding data in the system. Again, it goes back to what I mentioned before. So if you're holding personally identifiable information in a memo, then you're going to have to manually do that, and you're creating yourself work if you're going to have to anonymize data. So you really need to think about it. Sorry, I should have mentioned that, and it won't, like I say, won't check user defined fields either, the analysis fields, because they are custom to your system, and Sage doesn't know what's held in there. There is a log on the ideas hub that you should be able to flag things as person identifiable. So to go and vote on that, and it's something that Sage encourage. Sorry, there's another question there. Sage, the web version of Sage 200 that is coming later in the year, unfortunately due to the current situation that has been put back slightly, is not the same as self-service. Self-service is something you have available in your user. You have one connected user available in your system as standard. It does need some setup, and it is really just for giving reporting access to people. The web version of Sage 200 is going to be a proper browser-based interface. There will be limitations and caveats when it first comes out, as in what you're going to be able to do with it, but it will be much more rounded Sage 200 functionality. But yeah, okay, well, I think that is all of our questions. Obviously, if anybody does think of anything else, please do feel free to contact us. And as I say, we are looking to run more of these sessions, so let us know, give us some feedback, and yeah, we hope to see you again in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Steph. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.